Bruna is a facilitator, writer, public speaker, and humanitarian activist. She holds an MSc in Sociology and Global Change from the University of Edinburgh, with a focus on forced displacement and climate change. She has visited and worked with refugee communities in Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, Serbia, France, among other countries. She is the founder and director, apologies for how I pronounce this, of Círculos de Hospitalidade, a Brazilian nonprofit organization whose work lies in regenerating a culture of peace and hospitality in times of polarization and xenophobia against refugees and vulnerable immigrants. Please join me in warm welcoming Bruna.
Well, thank you for the introduction, Rebecca. And hello, everyone. I feel really honored to be with you today in this beautiful event. I landed from Brazil yesterday, so I'm a bit jet lagged. And as I mentioned to Joe earlier, I haven't been speaking English for a while, so you have to excuse me if I mispronounce anything or if I get lost. So it feels really nice to be back here at Ethelburga's, and as I mentioned, I feel honored and humbled to be here. And I know that Celia is not here anymore, but I wanted to thank her for reminding us of the power of a broken heart, because it was a broken heart and a burning question of how can I be of service that brought me here today, and that has taken me to so many places, from the edge of places like favelas in Brazil to indigenous territories, and also to the heart of refugee camps in different places. And less than a month ago, UNHCR, the UN Agency for Refugees, released its latest report, Global Trends, Forced Displacement in 2022. And the report estimates that there is more than 110 million people forcibly displaced worldwide because of persecution, wars, and human rights violations. And if we were to include the numbers of people being displaced because of climate breakdown, disasters, and extreme weather events, the numbers would be much higher. But I guess that we can't lose or we can't forget that behind these numbers, we're talking about people. We're talking about broken dreams and their stories as well. And some of the effects of this mass displacement, of mass migration, is human suffering and further conflict and further human rights violations, and even political and societal polarization, as migration is one of the most polarizing topics or subjects of our times. So in honor of those who are displaced from their homelands, risking their lives and seeking protection, and finding in many places hostility instead of hospitality and dignity, I would like to open my talk with a quote from the late Zen Master Thich Nhat Hanh. He said this in the aftermath of September 11, but I feel his words are prayer for our times as well. So he said, "We are aware there is tremendous amount of suffering going on. There's shock, there's fear, anger, hatred, and sadness in ourselves and in the world. In this moment, we invoke all of our spiritual teachers to be with us, helping to embrace our suffering, to embrace the world, and to embrace humanity as a family. There are those of us trying to save, heal, and support, and we are grateful to them. There are those of us who are crying, who are suffering terribly in this moment, Let us breathe for all of them and embrace them tenderly with our compassion, our understanding, and our peace. We know that responding to hatred and violence with compassion is the only path for all of us. So let us breathe and embrace the world and embrace humanity as a family. And I just feel that this prayer invites us to listen, as we've been talking about the importance of listening, to listen and embrace the earth, humanity, and especially the poor on whom the burden of climate breakdown, armed conflicts, and wars falls even more heavily. So I'm posing the question of whether a spiritual humanitarian response can help us navigate the crises of our times, and I invite you to inwardly ask the same question and be aware of the subtlety of the response, because sometimes it's in the silence between the lines in the conversation that we can have some kind of inspiration or some kind of strength to help us move forward as we are facing what is being called the crisis of our times, or there's so many crises entangled together as what is also known as the polycrisis that present us some existential threats. And my interest in the relationship between climate change, ecological degradation, development projects, and forced displacement led me to a career change and to a master's to study in Edinburgh, and then to carry out some field research in South Africa, working in the field of conflict transformation in the midst of xenophobic wave. But before that, I worked as a dentist. So I had a degree in dentistry, and I worked as a dentist in Brazil for 5 years. And I was born on an island called Florianopolis, in a beautiful place, and I moved up north to one of the poorest regions in the country, located in the Amazon region. And you have to keep in mind that that area is a disputed area, marked by deforestation, illegal mining, expropriation of indigenous land, and a lot of social inequality. So I was exposed, or I witnessed human suffering for the first time there, and there is where my heart was broken. But back then, I was only 25 years old, and I didn't know what to do with that. I didn't know how to be in that place, how to hold my broken heart, how to relate to those feelings of despair, sadness. And it was precisely those feelings of injustice, social and ecological injustice, that I was probably experiencing for the first time, that led me to this career change and what might sound like a cliche, like just this search for meaning, search for purpose, when I couldn't find that in my job anymore. So now, 14 years later, I kind of understand when I look back that I didn't have the maturity, or because no one has ever taught me how to be in that place. And I guess this is something that we talk about now, how to hold the grief, or the importance of getting in touch and relate to our grief, to relate to our pain for the earth. And there's this kind of power when we root, or when we ground ourselves and we learn how to relate to this pain, and out of this pain come also our love for the earth and humanity. But back then I didn't know how to live from this meeting place. And I guess that throughout the years, life has taught me, or has put me into situations that I had to learn somehow. And today I direct an NGO called, as Rebecca tried to say in Portuguese, Círculos de Hospitalidade, which means circles of hospitality. And our work aims to regenerate a culture of peace and hospitality in times of xenophobia, and this growing anti-refugee or anti-migrant sentiment. And over the past few years, we have worked with more than 8,000 people from more than 45 nationalities. And as I mentioned before, this work came from this burning question, came from a broken heart, that I had a few years to relate to this broken heart, to relate to this question, so I could understand what my call was. And it brought me a lot of confusion, because we always think that this career change happens overnight, that somehow you wake up one day knowing what you have to do. And it didn't really play out, at least for me, this way. I had many years without knowing what to do, and I was sometimes living in agony, because I knew that I had to do something, and I knew there was something calling to me, but I didn't know what it was. And I had to trust life to guide me, to point to the places where I had to go, and to teach me how I had to be so I could do what I do today. And in early 2023, the World Economic Forum annual meeting shed light and brought to the global conversation this theme that we are familiar with, that we have arrived in the age of polycrisis. And when we think of polycrisis, we're talking about widespread social and political unrest, geopolitical confrontation, wars, disruption, mass migration, climate breakdown, and other events all playing together, interacting at different layers on a global scale, bringing a lot of human suffering, causing a lot of despair and fractures within and across communities, and also presenting these new existential threats. So, inspired by the field by the spiritual ecology field, spiritual humanitarianism also proposes that the consciousness, the mindset that is behind or causing this polycrisis that we're facing is this belief of separateness, that we are separate from each other, that we are separate from the world. And at the root of this crisis lies an ethical and spiritual crisis that must be recognized and addressed from a place of oneness, from a deep place within us, a deep place that also teaches us how to care and love the earth and humanity. And it's when we connect with this sacred place within us that is action comes to heal what is broken. And individually and collectively, we know that chaos and crisis can also teach us, or can also be these gateways to transition and transformation. So what would happen if we were to face the crisis? And I understand that it's very difficult to face the crisis, as Claire mentioned in her opening, that people feel that one of the most challenges is to face the truth. So face the crisis, that we can embrace what is collapsing and disappearing. And I know this brings a lot of pain, but also embrace what is coming alive, what is taking form, trusting, even though we don't know how it's going to be, that we can participate in what is coming alive. And in the darkness of the turmoil that we are, it is always important to root oneself in the place where this grief meets the love for the earth. Sustain oneself rooted in this sacred soil. It's a great challenge. And this work has taught me that when we root ourselves in this meeting place, in this sacred soil, a kind of alchemy takes place. And it's really difficult to put in words. But when you trust And when you really give your life to service, some kind of alchemy of magic that infuses your actions, your thoughts, and your attitude. And it's this magic that has sustained me, and I know that sustains a lot of people, because it's difficult to be at the front line where there's so much human suffering and how we relate to that suffering. So the current humanitarian crisis is unprecedented. The number that I mentioned earlier of 110 million displaced people worldwide has never been this high. And the reports show that it's growing by the year. And as I mentioned before, if we add to this equation or to this figure, people who are being displaced of climate change, the number can be much higher, and it's also scary. And what also scares me is, despite of the scale of the human suffering and these humanitarian needs, there's also a global narrative in which refugees and vulnerable migrants are portrayed and treated as threats to national security, to our cultural heritage, to social order. And so if we perceive something as a threat, as a problem, we're going to react to this threat by contracting ourselves in fear, by raising walls of separation, dividing or separating us from them. And this is what we're seeing. And on the other hand, if we try to be open and curious and ask the question, why are they here? What is happening? Where they come from? If we open ourselves to recognize the human being behind the headlines, if we open ourselves to recognize that they're potential friends, that they can contribute to the development of our societies, then and only then we can create programs to integrate these people, to integrate into our societies, including mental health and psychosocial support, access to education, and other opportunities. So an ethical and spiritual response to the crisis, open our hearts instead of contracting it into fear. And I don't say this naively, because I work at the front line, so I understand there's a lot of challenge. So it's not only about good intention, there's a lot of work to do. And this work also helps us to do our inner work, to look inside and to see how we also contributing to this crisis that are taking place in other, like the ways that we're consuming and the ways that we live, how privileged we are, and how our privilege also comes with a lot of human suffering. And there's something, since I started working with humanitarian crisis, in humanitarian field, there's something that always stays in my mind, that sometimes it feels that this mass displacement that we're witnessing at the surface of the earth is also a reflection of this inner displacement. So David was saying at the beginning about this separation. So if we are as a community separated from our sacred nature, so if we don't recognize ourselves as sacred beings, the earth and all of the more than human world as sacred, if we're displaced from our inner place, then some traditions, and I believe in that how these inner worlds find ways to take form into this outer reality. Thus, this consciousness of creating space, despite all the noise in our society, to connect with a deeper place within us, to nurture this relationship and to feel nurtured by it, to witness what is happening from this place, and then taking action if you feel inclined to. For me, it seems like a way forward, and this is what I've been doing for the past few years. And as some of you may know, Brazil was severely impacted by the pandemic. And the lack of leadership and political response worsened the socioeconomic and health crisis, which triggered a lot of suffering and put the country back on the UN hunger map. Marginalized populations such as indigenous people, the Black communities, and refugees were the most impacted by the crisis, so the ones who were carrying the heaviest burden. In mid-March 2020, I started to receive an overwhelming number of desperate messages from refugee families who were supported by the organization that I run. And during that period, our projects focused on legal advice, on integration programs, and Portuguese classes, multicultural gatherings, but not on donations, so not on CBI or cash-based intervention or financial benefits or anything related to that. But when the refugees started to send me photos of the families that we were supporting, photos of their empty fridges, saying they had lost their jobs and they didn't have any savings, which meant that they didn't have anything to eat, I knew that the need of the moment has shifted. So I had to be attentive to that, to be detached from what we've been doing so far. So to recalibrate my eyes and the organization's work so we could implement a humanitarian response to the socioeconomic and health impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I remember this one night that I spent crying because I had a list with about 100 families on it, and I only had 50 food packets to deliver to them. So I had to choose from a worksheet those who would receive food on the following day and those who wouldn't. And of course, it felt really uncomfortable. And from the pain of that night, or from the broken heart again, a question emerged. So what is my to do? What can I do? How can I respond? And I just asked God to guide me, because I had no idea how we were going to face that crisis, but we did. And even though we had limited resources, and by resources I mean financial, human, material knowledge, the call to respond, or the call to delve deep into the cracks of people's suffering, spoke louder, and we had to trust. And I say we because we were and we are a team working in this organization, and we had to trust that call with our health and our life, because we were putting our health at the front lines as well. And so I wrote a proposal and I applied an emergency fund, and we received enough funding to feed people for a couple of years and to donate food and personal hygienic kids items and money for the families so they could pay for the rent and the expenses. But because of the sanitary measures, public transportation was suspended, so they couldn't come to us. We had to go to them. So we had to map the region, organize a team of volunteers who would be willing to drive to people's place to deliver food, and visiting their homes in the communities, in favelas and other places, usually on marginalized areas, just added another layer of understanding of their situation and compassion. But it also added another layer of suffering, because we were witnessing the suffering of so many families that we had to deal with that as well. And we always carried more food packages when we were driving to those places to give to Brazilians as well, as ways to prevent conflict and tension in the communities, because we were aware of that narrative we are also in need, we're Brazilians, why are you giving to them and not to us? So there's always this need of trying to map the needs of the most vulnerable and respond equally to those needs. Otherwise, you're just going to add fuel to the conflict or to the possibility of conflict in those areas because they were also in need. And I was responsible for an impoverished area with one of the lowest human development index in my home state. So after a few months of work that seemed to have no end, which included listening to them and going to their homes, but also keeping a motivated team and balanced work environment, and negotiating with funders and donors and politicians and all of that, I was just exhausted and on this edge of a breakdown, but I didn't have time to feel that because there's just so much happening and so many people who relied on me, so I couldn't feel the exhaustion. I just couldn't allow myself to breathe and have the space. But I remember the day that I had that space, that I paused in the middle of the storm, and it was mid-spring 2020, and spring in the southern hemisphere happens in October, November, sorry. And a tropical storm hit our region. It hit during a food delivery day. So the rain and wind started when I was in the market buying more food packages because we would buy enough to fill our cars, and then once it was over, we had to buy more. And so it started when I was in the market, and I remember that the front sign was blown away by the wind. And so I went back to my car and I just thought I could drive home and save before the storm got worse, or I could first deliver for these few families and then drive probably in the middle of the storm. And I chose the later because these people needed that food, needed that help. And so I delivered, and then on the highway driving back home, and I was driving more attentive than ever because I knew that a moment of distraction could cause an accident. I was driving uphill through an indigenous territory, which is called in Portuguese Morro dos Cavalos, or House Mountain in English. And while I was driving up, I looked up the sky. And on one side, the sky was really dark, and we say in Portuguese, but I'm not sure if you use this expression in English, heavy with the storm. And it felt like the sky was falling. And then on the other side, the sun was just like the sunlight was just going through the clouds. And that vision, that might sound very simple, came with an experience and came with understanding. It came with kind of like an aha moment that was very important for me, and I still carry this moment with me. And I kind of believe that experience sustained me sane while I was trying to navigate the storm that we are in. So we have arrived in the age of polycrisis, a crucial time in our existence. And this is a place, an era that invites us to witness and feel the pain, the grief of what is collapsing, what is disappearing, the loss. But it's also a place that allows us or invites us to contribute to build these bridges, right? To build these bridge connections and forging connections. And I guess that we invited to be the hands that build these bridges, to be the bricks that are part of these bridges, but also to be the feet that walk across the bridges that we are trying to. Yes, I'm almost done. So in my understanding, the sky and the Morro dos Cavalos revealed a deeper layer of the work that needs to be done, or brought an awareness that I needed to hold, and an understanding of how to relate to this place, to this sky, that holds both the darkness and the light, both what is collapsing, what is falling, what is disappearing, and what we need to love and learn to be this place. So only too often we watch the news and we read about the state of the world and the climate breakdown, the biodiversity loss, our consumption habits that are consuming us and the earth, and the lack of political will to adopt measures that might mitigate or that might end some of the adverse effects of climate change and destroy and avoid destruction of the planet. And of course that we feel sad and hopeless. And working with victims of humanitarian crisis also puts us in this place of sadness. That we're in contact with stories of suffering, of trauma, but also with stories of courage, resistance, resilience. So when we look at the scale of the world's problem, of the trouble that we are in, and the numbers and the predictions, the feeling of despair and hopelessness emerge, and we might feel inclined to turn our backs away because it seems so big for us to respond. And I always go back to two quotes from Lao Tse. So the one is, the journey of 1,000 miles begin with one step. So it's always one step. And another one, great acts are made of small deeds, because we also think that the problem seems so big that the response needs to be so big. Sometimes just small deeds, small acts of kindness and love, because small is also beautiful. So Círculos of Hospitality is a small organization, yet it carries the seeds of a different way of relating to the world and to one another. We value self-care, community care, and we try to infuse love and dedication in everything that we do. We create spaces in which people from different cultures and backgrounds, religions, meet and interact as ways to prevent conflict, to promote social cohesion and peaceful existence. And we are just one step, one small deed, one drop in the vast ocean. And I believe there are many communities and organizations worldwide that also carry these seeds that are also small steps and beacons of light, holding the threads of life together. And this awareness sustain our existence, so we need each other. And this is my invitation for each one of you to just create inner space to ask yourself what you can do and hold on to this small deed, because it is important, even though we think it's just too small to the magnitude of the crisis that we are in. Thank you.